Hi everybody, it's Mike Jehle, Executive Director at the Fairfield Museum, and I'm here with Walt today to kick off the third and final installment of the Burning of Fairfield video tours. At this time of year, we commemorate the anniversary of Fairfield's burning by the British during the American Revolution. It was a time of tremendous destruction, suffering, and economic devastation for our community when much of the town's homes and jobs were destroyed. And it took many years for Fairfield to recover. But I think there's one thing that this story of Fairfield's burning can teach us today, and that is, during the current pandemic and a time of economic and social uncertainty, we can be a strong and resilient community that has overcome many difficult and painful times in the past, and we've always emerged stronger as a result. The Fairfield Museum is an important place of learning and conversation, where history can be a starting point for exploring and understanding the current issues and questions we face. We believe that bringing the community together to bridge the diverse experiences and perspectives we can work together to build a stronger sense of community identity, deepen our civic engagement, and create a more empathetic and equitable community for all of us. The Fairfield Museum is a community-supported nonprofit that relies on your support to stay afloat. So if you share our commitment to build a strong and resilient community for our children, please consider joining us as a member or making a small donation to help support the community work that we do. You can find information on our website, fairfieldhistory.org, or by clicking the donate button below on this Facebook Live presentation. Thanks for participating in all these virtual programmings, and we look forward to seeing you at the Fairfield Museum.
Hello everybody. Today we are talking about the burning of Fairfield. We're here on the Town Hall Green, right here at the intersection of Beach Road and Old Post Road, which was the epicenter of that attack in 1779. In fact, today is actually the 241st anniversary of those troops marching right up Beach Road here into Fairfield. The first sighting actually happened on July 4th. We have a letter from Priscilla Lothrop Burr, who's actually writing to her sister-in-law. Now, she's actually writing the letter in August, but when she writes the letter, she talks about on July 4th, they actually see the British fleet. So there were 4 warships and probably between 20, maybe 30 transports. It's not completely clear how many there actually were. But they sailed by. At this point, they were traveling east, but people in Fairfield were very concerned. We've already talked about this idea that there had been raids along the coast, the kidnapping of Gold Selleck-Silliman, and to see this large British fleet sailing in the Long Island Sound was terrifying. But the fleet continued to the east. Many people actually thought it was actually going to go to New London. New London during the American Revolution is a major port here in Fairfield, especially for the Continental Navy. The ship defense, Captain Smedley from Fairfield, its commander during the latter part of its career, actually sailed in and out of New London Harbor on a regular basis. In fact, that's where she is lost. That's actually where she ends up running aground and sinking. So the forces were first seen then, but the ships continued. Now everybody, as I said, thought they were going to go to New London, but it turned out they were actually going to go to New Haven. So on July 5th and 6th, New Haven was raided by the force that would later come to Fairfield. They landed, they were able to capture the harbor. They were there for a fort, believe it or not, another Fort Black Rock. That they were able to capture. They spiked the guns. They were able to capture some ships. Some ships were also burned, and there were some structures in New Haven that were burned, but nowhere near what we were going to see later in this group of raids. Now, some people ask, why did these raids happen? Now, part of this idea in General Clinton, the overall commander of the British forces, headquartered at New York, was that he would be able to draw General Washington's army out of the Hudson Highlands along the Hudson River and bring them closer to New York, where then he could march his army out and attack Washington's forces. So the hope was that in these raids along the coast, Washington would send his forces and set up this to Clinton's advantage. After the forces leave New Haven, Many of the militia that had already gathered at New Haven, it's known as the New Haven Alarm, including men from Fairfield, Stratford, Milford, the surrounding towns, went to New Haven because the British forces were there. When the British forces left, that militia contingent is a little unsure, once again, exactly where they're going to go. It's unsure, they're unsure if they will now continue to New London, or where else were they done? Could they possibly return back to New York? Nobody was sure. It wasn't until the morning of July 7th that the fort at Black Rock, the local Coast Guard, if you will, noticed the fact that these ships were off the coast of Fairfield. And Isaac Jarvis fired a gun. He was overall commander, so he had one of the guns fired at the fort, which alerted people in the town. And the story is that about 7 o'clock or so, a little bit later, a fog rolls in. And although the ships were underway when the fog rolled in, nobody was sure what the fleet might do as it continued, or if it continued. About 10:30, the fog lifted and they found the fleet at anchor off of what would today be Jennings and Penfield Beach in that area, actually maybe a little bit farther to the west. The ships had anchored, which told everybody in the town that these troops were actually going to come into Fairfield. The first 800 troops under General Tryon will actually land at what's called the Pines, the term the Pines. We believe it's somewhere about where South Pine Creek actually comes up alongside the beach area, along basically the peninsula that's formed by South Pine Creek and Long Island Sound. There will be roughly 800 troops. That will include the guards. There are grenadier guards and light infantry of the guards regiment, some of the best soldiers there are in the British Army. There will be a contingent of the Landgraf force, so there's a Hessian regiment, Landgraf, and there will also be an entire regiment of loyalists. It's known as the King's American Regiment, and this is interesting because many of these men had actually lived in the area. We do know that there is one of their captains, Thomas Chapman, is actually identified. People recognize him in reports that they give later. They talk about seeing him, including Eunice Burr, who actually specifically mentions that she said to him, I know you, you've come to visit my home. So there is this kind of idea that many of these people know each other. And those troops will land there at the Pines. They will march up what is inherently Fairfield Beach Road. On the way in, there will be a small contingent of militia that will stop and fire upon them, but they're quickly dispersed. And by about 5 o'clock or so, 6 o'clock, the town green has basically been captured. Now, during this whole process, part of the strategy was that General Tryon wanted to attack the fort in Black Rock. Once again, remember, the area of Black Rock all the way to today, Park Avenue, was actually part of Fairfield. And there was a fort there on the hill. And so they wanted to capture that fort. And by capturing the fort, they could destroy the guns, destroy the fort, as well as actually destroying any ships that were in Black Rock Harbor, which was also a fairly major harbor at the time of the American Revolution. So the troops marched to what is today Ash Creek, and the local militia knows that they can't stop them. There's not enough. We don't think at that point there's probably any more than perhaps 50, maybe 150 total that ever get to Fairfield over the 2 days that the British are here. But by that point, we think there could be between 50 and 100, and there's no way they're going to stop these 800 soldiers. So what they do is they tear up the bridge over Ash Creek. So now the British can't cross the creek without exposing themselves to fire from the militia, and so they're basically stopped from getting to the fort, which probably infuriates General Tryon. Now, while that's all going on, the fleet moves. It actually moves farther to the west to basically what is Kenzie's Point or Sasko Beach in that area. And so they bring the ships there. Now, at that point, they unload approximately another 1,700 troops. These troops are under General Garth, and they will actually land at Kensey's Point, and they will march into Fairfield up what is basically Sasco Hill Road to Oldfield. There will be a group that will actually go up into the area of Mill Plain Road, where Mill Plain and Umpqua, they'll sort of take over that area. And so basically by the end of the 7th, there are approximately 2,500 to 2,600 troops in Fairfield at different areas. So what's going to happen overnight is that, as we said, the militia was in New Haven, so they're coming. Like I said, at the beginning of the attack, we think maybe 50, 75 troops. By the evening, we're starting to look at 100 and 150 troops. And so there are troops that gather, and they gather at Round Hill, which is today part of Fairfield University. It's in the lower southwest corner of Fairfield University. For those who are familiar, if you know where Bellarmine Hall actually sits at the top of what is Round Hill, and that's where the militia, we're told, gathers. It's about a little over a mile from where we're located. And from there, they probably had a great view of the area that the British control. Now, by that point, the British are going to be controlling everything from roughly Mill River to Ash Creek, so Mill River in the west, Ash Creek in the east, from Long Island Sound to approximately Barlow Road. And like I said, there was that little area up to Mill Plain, Umpqua to Mill Plain, that they control also. And then back over to Mill River. So roughly 3 miles across and about 2 miles north-south that the British will actually control. We know that there's some skirmishing, firing that is going to go on over the course of the evening. And the British begin setting fires. Now, a young boy, actually he's a teenager, by the name of William Wheeler will leave an account in his diary, and he mentions that the first structure to be set on fire is actually a guardhouse or post close to Kensey's Point. So once again, over on Sasco Hill, close to Sasco Beach, that area, there is a structure that gets set on fire. Fairly soon after that, there's a home right at the corner of where Round Hill Road and Barlow intersects, that it is set on. It's the first home as far as we know. And then there are 2 or 3 other structures that are set on fire that evening. There is no record of an actual order being given to set these fires, so it's a little unclear as to whether they're being set to kind of let the patriots, the local militia, know that the British mean business, or if there's some other action going on. What we do know is that during this period, Reverend Sayer, who's minister at the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, actually is sent under a flag of truce to Colonel Whiting, who's in charge by this point of the militia, with a letter from General Tryon, basically listing, his demands and things. And Colonel Whiting responds with a somewhat lengthy and interestingly worded letter, but basically he says, no, we're not giving in to you. You've already started setting fires. We're going to we're not gonna give up. So that really tells General Tryon something important, which is the longer he stays here, the more dangerous his position could become. So by the morning of July 8th, there is they take one of the ships. Now, one of the ships that the British bring with them is called a row galley. It's a style of ship used in the 18th century, which actually has oars. Although it's a ship, it's a rigged ship, it's a sailing ship, it actually has ports in the side that they can put out oars known as sweeps, and they could actually row the ship, this large ship. And so they bring it in off of that fort at Black Rock, and for an hour or so, they fire at each other. The fort's firing at the ship's firing at the fort. And during that time, Tryon begins to round up his troops because he knows he's got to get them back to the ships. that's when the bulk of the fires begin, and many of the reports and information that we get, the depositions from the women. Now, there's primarily women in the town at the time for a couple of reasons. One, many of the men who had chosen to fight for the Patriot Army or Navy had already left the town, so they're not here. So, and then many of the other men that are still here for whatever list of reasons are part of the militia, so they have left the center of town, these homes. So it's primarily women and children and the elderly that are actually located. So that becomes part of the story. And so many of the reports that we actually have, the after-action reports, the depositions, are actually being given by women who are here in the town. And they report several things. They report that that the Hessians, the German troops, are part of the group that is setting the fires. Now, this may be partially true. It's hard to say. But the truth is that we do know the Hessians, because General Tryon in his after-action report actually tells us that the Hessians protect the army as they're marching out. So they're the rear guard. They're the ones who are holding up to holding back the militia. Because what also starts to happen is, as I said, these fires start. Now, there is another group that comes into play into this story. We've talked a little bit about loyalists, and we did mention that there was a regiment called the King's American Regiment that came. Well, there's also a loyalist unit that comes, the Associated Loyalists. They're not an organized regiment. They're sometimes affectionately known as associators. The British will use the term associators. Now, these are people who are not regular soldiers. They're kind of here. They've been driven out of Connecticut and parts of New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts because of the fact that the Patriots have taken much of this territory. They've gone to New York and offered their services. And many of them are somewhat perhaps in it for themselves. They have their own personal vendettas. And these groups may have had more to do with starting many of the fires. Now, the fires will not only happen in this area that I've spoken of, there will also be fires that will take place in what is today Southport. At the time, it's known as Mill River. So there are structures that are going to be burned there. And then Green's Farms, which is also at that time part of Fairfield, also is burned. There are structures and a meeting house that are burned there. Part of the reason we chose the spot today is not just is this the epicenter of the story, but if you look directly behind me here, there is a home that we call the Isaac Tucker or Jonathan Maltby house. It was built by Isaac Tucker, but Isaac Tucker only lived there for about 10 years, a little over 10 years, and he sold it to Jonathan Maltby, and it actually belonged to Jonathan Maltby at the time of the American Revolution. Now, at the time of the attack, Jonathan Maltby is not actually home. He is away. He's in the Continental Navy. He's actually an officer in the Continental Navy. But the British come, and this is one. There's actually three more that we can't see. There's the Hobart home and then the two Bulkley homes. They actually survive the burning in this part of Fairfield. And so these structures will survive. And Maltby's home has maybe one of the more exciting stories because we don't believe that the Bulkley homes or the Hobart home, and there was a tavern which we can't see, the Bulkley Tavern, none of those are burned, but we don't believe the British ever tried to burn them. We believe part of the reason that those structures survive, it has to do with the fact that when the British Army first marched up Beach Road, those are the first structures they came to. And so the British, Tryon or officers are saying this building, I'm going to stay in it because they pretty much know they're going to be here over the evening of July 7th to the 8th. So they know that they're going to be here. So they pick those homes, and those homes are saved. We know that Reverend Elliott pleads for the saving of homes. We know that Reverend Sayer pleads for the savings of homes and structures so that the people will have some. So those may have been some of the structures. But Jonathan Maltby's house, they actually tried to burn. There are actually burn marks today. It's a private home, but I've had the good fortune of being able to go inside. There are actually burn marks in the front hall and as well as in the back, what was probably the keeping room at the time in the 18th century. And we believe that Jonathan Maltby's slave actually is who came down and put out those fires and saved the structure, saved the home. So it was his efforts that prevented the structure from being burned. The troops march out of Fairfield. They'll return to Kenzie's Point, at which point they will re-embark upon their ships and they will leave. Now from Fairfield, they actually go back to Long Island. They'll spend roughly a day in Long Island refitting and resupplying. And then they will turn around and they will actually come back and attack Norwalk. Now by this point, the local militias have figured out that Norwalk is the next logical spot for the British to come. And so they are actually there, and there's actually a bit more of a battle. Norwalk will also be burned. The vast portion of Norwalk will also be burned. And so the British will leave the Connecticut coast after that, those events, and they will go back to New York. The interesting thing to note about this story is that Tryon is never given a large-scale command again after this. There will be another town or city, if you will, in Fairfield. New London itself will actually be attacked eventually in 1781 under the command of none other than Benedict Arnold, who by that point had already defected to the British cause. Fairfield will lose approximately 240 total structures. 97 of those are homes. The rest are stores, buildings. There are 2 meeting houses, so this also includes Green's Farms, which is part of Fairfield at the time. So there are 2 meeting houses, the Anglican Church, the county courthouse, which today is Old Town Hall, the county jail, which was actually sat where today St. Paul's Church stands. So many of these structures are destroyed during the attack. Fairfield, some of these structures will take up to 10 years before they're rebuilt. The meeting house and the courthouse in particular. Even the Burr's home, it takes almost 10 years from the time of the burning for them to completely rebuild. So Fairfield spends many years after this attack rebuilding, getting itself back together. But it does, and it is able to accomplish that. But during that time, a little community just to the east, which will become known as Bridgeport, begins to grow. It becomes a time for many of the people who had lived in Fairfield begin to move out of this central area of Fairfield, or what was the central area at that time, here along the coast, and begin to move. And Newfield and Stratfield are 2 of the places that begin to take in many of those people. So I thank you so very much. I hope you've enjoyed. Once again, if you have comments or thoughts or wish to show your support, membership, donations, fairfieldhistory.org or the donate button for us here on Facebook. And I hope you've enjoyed. I really do appreciate your time. And I look forward to seeing you on the History Trail.